In Victorian England, vast wealth existed inches away from grinding starvation. While the upper class sat at tables filled with roasted meats and sweet desserts, a dark shadow of industrial smog concealed millions of people fighting a daily battle for survival in the streets below. We are looking at survival decisions, meals eaten by children every day, including substances that were never intended for human consumption. By looking at what these people ate, we can see the reality of poverty in a way that statistics can't capture. This era created a specific kind of economic vacuum. Cities and factories expanded at a massive scale, and while workers spent their lives on these crowded floors, wages remained low enough to keep most families in a state of constant hunger. For the millions trapped in this system, eating had nothing to do with taste or tradition. It was a daily struggle to acquire enough raw calories to outlast the next shift. One of the most common ways to find those calories was dripping on bread. After wealthier households finished cooking meat, they collected the leftover hardened fat. This dripping was cooled and sold cheaply to those who couldn't afford the meat itself. Poor families spread this cold, hardened grease onto stale bread. It was heavy, oily, and difficult to enjoy, but it provided the dense energy needed to endure long factory shifts. Children often ate this before heading to work, relying on the fat to fuel 10 or 12 hours of labor. For the Victorian poor, these fatty scraps served as a direct conversion of pennies into the physical energy required to keep the industrial machine moving. Stepping into the overcrowded slums reveals how this struggle affected the family unit. In these dense alleyways, a single meager wage had to be divided among a high number of mouths every single day. Families relied on peas pudding to manage this. By boiling cheap yellow split peas into a thick, heavy paste, they created a filling substance that could be cooked in a large batch and eaten for several days without variation. This was a mathematical strategy. This timeline shows a single batch of peas pudding stretched across multiple days, leaving families with a massive caloric deficit. Eating was reduced to a calculated delay of starvation. When actual calories ran out, survival depended on ways to trick the stomach. People began using sensory distractions to manage the physical pain of an empty belly. They used weak tea, made from leaves that had already been boiled multiple times until they were entirely depleted. Drinking this hot, watery liquid alongside fat-soaked bread caused the stomach to expand, creating a temporary, false sensation of fullness. Another method involved eating raw onions with a chunk of bread. The sharp, stinging flavor of the onion was so strong that it distracted the brain from the gnawing sensation of hunger, allowing workers to focus on their tasks for a few more hours. Basic starches like gruel and watery potato paste were used to provide physical weight. In workhouses and prisons, thousands of people sat in halls like this, consuming flavorless liquids that offered almost no nutrition but took up space in the gut. This was a way to buy time. Filling the stomach with warm, flavorless water delayed the return of physical agony, helping the poor endure the remaining hours of the day. Hunger was a constant, unforgiving presence, forcing millions of people to find ways to lie to their bodies just to make it through the night. Meat markets highlighted the barrier between nourishment and the poor. While fresh cuts were visible in the shop windows, they remained entirely out of reach for those scavenging in the streets. Victorian bone broth was made from the bare bones discarded by butcher shops, often stripped of every usable piece of meat before being sold to the desperate poor for almost nothing. Families would spend hours boiling these empty bones, using up their scarce fuel in a desperate attempt to extract any remaining fat or flavor. Most of the time, the result was nothing more than cloudy water with a faint smell of what used to be food. At this stage, the boiling pot provided more than just a liquid to drink. It provided the psychological comfort of hope. The presence of a warm pot on the stove was often the only reason to believe they might not go to sleep hungry. At the absolute bottom of this descent, the line between food and waste began to disappear. This desperation led to the sale of penny milk. It was heavily watered down and mixed with unsafe thickeners just to keep its white color. Mothers bought it because they had no other choice, and for many children, this was the only nourishment they ever knew. People also turned to extreme scavenging. They revived weeks-old rock-hard bread by soaking it in dirty water or broth. Others rubbed bread against empty, greasy pans just to collect whatever trace of fat remained from a previous meal. When there was nothing else, they gathered nettles and weeds from roadsides or boiled coarse mixtures of animal feed. These were substances that provided almost no nutrition, but offered a brief sense of physical warmth. Relentless hunger eventually lowered the standard of what was acceptable until the definition of food included anything the body could physically swallow. The Victorian era was defined by chance, the chance of finding a scrap or a bone. Our modern era is defined by choice. Today, food is tied to identity, culture, and pleasure. But for the Victorian poor, it was a tool used to endure horrific conditions. They consumed these substances for one reason: to ensure they could wake up and work again the next day. Which of these survival strategies shocked you the most? And if you were faced with that kind of hunger, what boundaries would you be willing to cross to survive? These meals are largely forgotten, but they tell a story of endurance. The terrifying human instinct to survive at any cost remains a fundamental part of who we are today.